What about if it was just the appearances without the empty tomb? Now, most people in the ancient world, they already knew that visions and appearances of recently dead people occurred. People do have visions of people who recently passed on, right? But such visions meant precisely that these people were dead, not alive. And that contrasts with Jesus's resurrection, where people believed that he was back alive. And even if several such appearances had occurred, as long as the tomb was occupied by a dead body, they would have no reason to think that the resurrection happened, right? So over here, what I've shown is that the empty tomb alone would not be sufficient, because it's easy to explain it away for a first century Jew. Neither is it sufficient to say that, well, we have Jesus's appearances, but the body is still in the tomb. Remember that the first century Jews believe in a bodily resurrection. So to have the body still present in a tomb is going to defeat the whole idea of resurrection for them altogether. So would they have become Christians if only one of this happened? They wouldn't. So the first set of counter arguments that the skeptics propose to try to explain one condition and ignore the other would not be a reasonable one, because just one of them would not be sufficient condition. What we need, so I've shown that the alternative theories, by just picking one of this, would not be able to explain the rise of early Christianity, right? One of them is easy to explain, and it's not sufficient for a first century Jew. So they must have occurred together for them to be sufficient. Together, that's how a first century Jew now have good reasons to think that, hey, something significant or weird or unexpected had really happened. Number one, this fits our understanding of what a resurrection is. It's a bodily resurrection. The body is no longer in the tomb. Number two, we expect the resurrection to happen at end times. But hey, this Jesus is appearing prematurely at a time where we were not expecting. Now, this would be, I argue, a sufficient condition to explain the rise of early Christianity. So even though individually they were insufficient, together they form a sufficient condition. So together, the empty tomb and appearances would be sufficient to explain the rise of early Christianity. Why? Because it meets their expectation of what resurrection means. The empty tomb shows that it was a bodily resurrection, and there was the unexpected element of a resurrection occurring before the end times, which challenges their first century Jewish thinking. And this gives them good reason to consider converting to Christianity. Now we talked about the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances being sufficient, but just being sufficient is not good enough, right? Because like I said earlier, sufficient just means that yes, it could explain it, but it could very well have been another explanation. What we need to be able to show here is that it's not just sufficient, but necessary, right? So is the combination of tomb plus appearances simply one thing that might have caused early Christian belief to arise, which just means that it's sufficient? Or is it the only thing that could possibly have done so, which would make it necessary? And if we can show that it's both sufficient and necessary, then hey, it sounds like the resurrection, right? Empty tomb and appearances. So I'm going to do a brief recap again. Rise of early Christian belief. Could it have been a natural man-made development? Given our first century Jewish understanding of resurrection, this is not very plausible or plausible. Something significant must have happened. The two prominent conditions were empty tomb and Jesus's appearances, the first line of arguments that tries to explain one and ignore the other doesn't work, because just one of these would not have been sufficient for a first century Jew to really believe that there was a resurrection that was different from what they were expecting, right? So why would they become a Christian? So the alternative theories that tries to explain one and ignore the other fails to explain the rise of early Christian belief. So while either of them alone were insufficient, together they form a sufficient condition. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we have to explore other alternative theories to see if there are other theories that could possibly explain the rise of early Christianity. Now, if we try to think of alternative theories and they all fail, then it seems to me that this is the only explanation that is possible, which means to say the condition of the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances would be the only explanation, and that makes it necessary. Why only? Because if we try to think of other theories, they all fail, right? So that would help us to conclude that it's not just sufficient, but necessary. So if I can show that they would fail to explain the events reasonably, we would be able to conclude that the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances was not just sufficient, but necessary.